Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Michael Van Pelton. I'm delighted that you're joining us this afternoon. Just over 8 months ago, I mused how COVID would intensify discussions and debate on the deeper and most pressing questions of our time. Individual rights versus collective good. Personal responsibility versus the we will take care of you state. What is an emergency and who has authority? Do I take support from the state when I really don't need it? When I'm rather fearful, who actually is my neighbor, especially when they work at the grocery store or at the long-term care facility? Who do I trust nowadays anyway? And how do the scientists get it so wrong? Or maybe even, how does a politician say he or she is wrong and you not crucify them with your scorn? Allow me to scale up to a bit more of a philosophical level, just a bit. When I organize many of the crucial themes I've heard over the last 8 months, they go something like this in my less than linear mind. 7 questions, quickly. Number 1, what in the world is happening? Think global instability, think increasing insecure categories. 2, when are you planning to stop by? Think demographic trends, less children, mobility issues, family breakdown, social isolation, and loneliness. Or 3, who does what? What institutions in society are best suited to do what job? Or 4, who cares? Will you love me enough to heal me? Will the next generation want to pay for the health of baby boomers? And are we seeing an end to charity in society? And 5, who am I? Think artificial intelligence, biotech, gender fluidity, end-of-life issues, identity politics. And 6, who's the boss? Think changing views of authority, social license, rule of law, which rights? And 7, why am I here? Think vocation, think changing views of work today, think personal and societal angst and search for meaning. Actually, these questions are really pretty practical questions, aren't they? In fact, there's rarely a policy paper or research effort that Cardus is working on that doesn't lean into one or more of these questions. So what are your questions? Months ago, I asked Ray to start forming the numerous conversations he and I were having right across the country into a way forward conversation based on Cardus's unique perspective on public life in Canada. Our moment is too complicated to hammer away at solutions that don't understand the problems. So really what Ray needs to do this afternoon is to let us into his head. Pennings, what are you thinking about? How do you give order to a rather complicated and public square today? What do you think we need to be watching and observing, and what worries you? So why have I asked Ray to do this? Of course, well, that's his job at Cardus. And, we've been friends ever since we were young men. And Ray reads ridiculous amounts of news in a day. And he reads thick books on theology and political life, stuff like that. But that's not why. Rather, simply, Ray has an intellectual fairness that's prescient for this moment. Ray has developed the gift to look at issues through the eyes of others and still keep a deep anchor of intellectual and spiritual integrity. During this COVID and ensuing economic crisis, Ray has steadily noted that we need to observe the transitional issues, but we really need to live into the transformational issues. I have to admit, I'm not always on track with Pennings on this front. Our whole executive team actually argues quite often on how to prioritize and tackle the issues of the here and the now compared to thinking ahead and really hitting on the trends and currents that are fundamentally changing society over time. So here's quickly how we'll spend our time together during this time you are with us. Ray will present for approximately 30 to 35 minutes, and then we're going to take questions for about 20 minutes. So please feel free to already put your comments and your questions in the question and answer section. Don't use the chat box, it's right beside the chat box. Authentically and sincerely, your thoughts, your experience, your questions and comments truly do inform how we work over time and how Cardus forms its thinking. So Ray, it's over to you now.
Well, thank you, Michael, and thank you all for coming this afternoon. It's a real privilege to be invited to share my thoughts with you. As Michael mentioned, we've been making the distinction between transitional issues, the stuff that's the headlines of the news every day, which admittedly, I don't know about you, but I sometimes tire of reading COVID stories and the latest numbers and all of the day-to-day stuff, and the bigger issues, what we've called the transformational issues, the things that a year from now, 3 years from now, we're still going to be dealing with, even once COVID is no longer the headlines and vaccines are out there and we've adjusted to a new normal. Because I think most of us would agree that what we're facing right now is something that is transformational in our lifetime. It is going to be something in which our life before 2020 is a different life than the one we're going to live after 2020. And there are a number of things that go into it. So what I've done this afternoon is I've identified 8 underlying themes that I sort of am paying attention to. And I'm going to walk through them relatively quickly and then transition to 10 sort of policy areas, things that are in the news right now, things that we pay attention to. As Michael mentioned, I'm going to try to do this all within 30 minutes or so. So this is going to be a minute and a half max per slide. It's going to be descriptive, introducing. It's not going to go into great depths. I am trusting that all of you have had opportunity either through the email attachment that was sent in advance or through the attachment that's there. There's a 7-page document that I'm working from. I have no other notes besides those. Embedded in those documents, you will see lots of links that take you to other articles in more depth, and certainly that'll provide you more explanation than I can do. So without further ado, let's wade into these 8 themes and these 10 issues. I'm going to forewarn you, given the haste with which I'm trying to do this, my segues aren't always going to be perfect or elegant, but hopefully the point will be clear. I think the first thing we need to start with is really when you think about living life together, the question is, what do we have in common? What is the common good? What do people understand the good life to be? When you open a newspaper, there is an assumption that we have something in common that we're aspiring towards, and what is being described for you fits somehow in that which you have in common with what the editor or the author thought. I want to suggest to you that well before COVID, we were in the midst of a very significant transition in terms of understanding the common good. If you want to peel things right back, we go back to our constitutions. In the Canadian Constitution, we talk about peace, order, and good government. Our American neighbors talk about life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. And there historically has been something about the structure of our order together that has been assumed. In recent years, and this has come especially with some of the racial tensions that have happened in the spring, as well as a number of issues over recent years regarding identity, we have moved from sort of a sense of common good in terms of a shared understanding to a sense of good in which individual identity is maximized. Autonomy and identity have taken on a new emphasis these days. And the result is that even as we think about what is good, what is flourishing, we no longer have the same answers to those questions. And we'll get back to that in various themes, but I think that's a pretty foundational place to start with, to understand the fact that when we say common good, it is rare anymore that we, our neighbors, and certainly people in different political parties, organizations, different neighborhoods mean the same thing. And that the result of that is that even how we use data changes rather significantly. Not only is our shared notion of good changed, there is also a very significant transition happening in terms of the very nature of institutions and who does what. Now, I find it very interesting. The predominant narrative that has been there through this pandemic has been that government has been the big institution that has helped us. And certainly, let's be honest, there is no institution other than government that could step in when an economy shuts down wholesale, as ours did in the spring, providing the income support and keeping people fed, especially given the fact that a good proportion of the population lives paycheck to paycheck. But I want to suggest to you that I think this narrative that is widely accepted is a bit mistaken. I actually think that one of the things the pandemic has shown is the centrality of the family. When in March, all of a sudden, we decided that schools had to shut down and daycares had to shut down, it was left for families to pick up the pieces and to take care of education and to take care of their own kids, even while the parents continued to work alongside. In many ways, I would argue that families have been the unspoken institution in the midst of this pandemic that has highlighted its own value and indispensable role as the foundational unit of society. But secondly, I also think, and we've read this as families are eating more meals together, as they're playing games together, as they're rediscovering each other along the way. It has not gone without its bumps. And certainly there are challenges in the midst of it all. But the family as an institution and the role of the family in society, I would suggest is being highlighted in the midst of this particular pandemic. Of course, I mentioned the fact of providing paychecks, and that government has been writing checks as if there was no tomorrow. Literally, we have seen record spending. And what is interesting is that this is taking place in a time in which the very nature of debt is being reconsidered. Just very quickly, I'm in my 50s. I entered public life in the 70s and 80s, becoming aware of, at that time, growing deficits and real concerns that what was happening was unsustainable. And those of you who are old enough to recall politics at that time, you will recall how we've gone from sort of a real emphasis on a mindlessness about debt and the growth of the state in the 70s and 80s. In the 90s and 2000s, we had a total shift in which we went from every government having a major deficit to every government being in the black in the early 2000s. What was interesting, and I highlight a book that is not that well known. Stephanie Kelton wrote a book in 2010. It's called Modern Monetary Theory. And for those of you who aren't economists, don't worry about the details of it. But there's a fundamental thing that took place there, which is actually informing our politics and informing the approach to government debt. We certainly saw that south of the border in terms of the Bernie Sanders campaign and a number of things. But I think we're also seeing it here, and it influences how government is approaching debt. And basically, the theory is this, that a sovereign state that has the power to borrow money should not think of debt in the same way as the rest of us do. For most of us, when we take on debt, it's on the liability side of our balance sheet, and we expect to have to repay that debt. Essentially, what modern monetary theory is saying is, wait a minute, when government invests in does spending, it's building roads and bridges and all sorts of things that have economic creating potential that don't find themselves on the asset side of the balance sheet. And therefore, we've been mistaken for a long time to put debt in the same way on the liability side. Sovereign states really don't need to repay that debt. They have the power to print money. And as long as that happens with some measure of equilibrium throughout the world and currencies being compared to each other do it at the same rate, that debt actually doesn't need to be repaid. We can leave all the particulars of that, but there is an underlying debate that's happening among economists right now as it relates to monetary policy that is having, I would argue, a very significant impact also on governments, particularly those on the progressive side of the political spectrum, who are thinking of debt with an underlying belief that perhaps this doesn't ever need to be repaid. We'll swing back to that when we look at the issues, but that's a significant undercurrent, I think, that is important to be aware of. Well, those are very, the common good, families, government, debt, those are very macro sort of things. But as we come a little closer to home in terms of what we do day to day, what is very significant is the fact that work itself is being reframed. Since March, we have paid an awful lot of people to stay home and do nothing. And the emphasis has been is that our work is really a means to a paycheck. And as long as we're providing an income for people to pay their bills, that's what matters. But I think you and I both know that, number one, that's problematic because at the end of the day, somebody needs to be producing the goods and services that we consume. But we have thought about work in the context of what it allows us to buy in terms of consumption. We have not been thinking of work, and goes well before the pandemic, but we put exclamation marks around in the midst of all of this. We have not been thinking about work, about the fundamental meaning and identity that it gives us. Work is much more than about money. Very much of our identity and meaning and personhood and mental health is caught up in our work, but also the creation of value, the creation of goods and services that are valued in the marketplace is an essential aspect. And we're in the midst of the very nature of work being rethought in the context of this pandemic. Not only, of course, is work being rethought, but as we all had to think about suddenly redoing our work processes, our workplaces also have been rethought. Technology has taken a new form. Even what we're doing right here, this particular presentation, I was privileged over the last few months when it was legal and safe to gather in person, to give in in-person gatherings. Now we're gathered here on a Zoom webinar, and most of us have adjusted to a good amount of our working world taking place in very different ways. And what of that is going to last down the road? And what are the implications? What are the implications for those who own office towers? And what's the implication for the price of real estate in terms of downtown city cores, as well as people now moving to more rural destinations, not expecting to go into the workplace every day, and the implications for commuter times? And there's a whole host of very tangible economic implications. I'd also suggest there were a couple of implications. I was talking to an architect the other day, and it was interesting. He pointed out to me and he said, I've been in this business a long time, and one of the things I've been privileged to see is a lot of architects come along the way, and I can usually tell who their mentor was in the first 5 years of their career, because that bears an impact their complete career. And he was musing out loud and wondering what the implications 10 years from now are for those architects who today were not having the sort of mentorship as people are figuring out new ways of working. Now, I'm not an architect. I don't know. Maybe that's not even the best example. But I think a lot of people in creative industries are realizing the fact you can work at home and perhaps even be a little more efficient. However, the very nature of work, the nature of mentorship, the nature of collaboration is changing rather significantly. Institutions themselves. We talk about work, we talk about workplaces. This is taking place in a broader multi-year change in which our very understanding of power, relationships, authority, and institutions is changing. It was just yesterday or 2 days ago, I think, that Pew in the States came out with a new global index in terms of trust in institutions. And it was, especially among those of a younger generation, the trust was plummeting in terms of their trust in all sorts of institutions. And when we cease to have trust in institutions, when all of a sudden we're not certain that we can trust the science or we can trust the regulating authority from not being pressured by the politics in terms of a new vaccine, when we don't trust what our political leaders are saying to us in terms of the health advice that is given, there's a host of implications for how life and society is lived. I find it interesting, and just to highlight the fact that this isn't just taking place right now. Obviously, a lot of us over especially the last month have been paying attention to the politics south of the border with the U.S. election. And I'm not going to wade into the particulars of the outcomes of the elections and the disputes and all of that. As I read the news and the complaining about the unfairness of the results that are happening from one side of the political spectrum, I'm reminded that 4 years ago, when President Trump was elected, we were having similar headlines through November and December about the unfairness of the Electoral College, about for and manipulation in terms of elections. And the processes for impeachment of President Trump started even before his inauguration. And here we are 4 years later, again, the legitimacy. The issue is not the particulars of who's right and who's wrong in each of these cases. The U.S. has their court systems and everything else to sort that through. What is significant, I think, is that the legitimacy of elections and the acceptance of the results on those who are on the losing side of those elections is no longer the same as it would have been 10 or 20 years ago. Our very structures are being questioned. And that we can look at that at a very local level in terms of our local health authority, national level in terms of elections. We've had Brexit. In Canada, we have sort of the Wexit movement, the Western alienation that is there present in some of our Western provinces. Confederation itself is being questioned in many ways that it wasn't even just a few years ago. In the midst of all of this, there are a couple of issues that, on the one hand, should be top of mind. They're very significant, and I don't think, regardless of where you are on the political spectrum, I think most people would agree that, I'm thinking particularly of the environment, I'm thinking of Indigenous issues. There are some significant issues and challenges and problems that need to be addressed. What strikes me is that, and I'll just take the environment and Indigenous just to take two issues. These are issues in which there is sort of a politically correct answer. If woe to the politician who questions whether or not you're going to meet this or that target, be it Kyoto or any of the subsequent targets that have been set internationally. If you raise any questions of that, you're a heretic along the way. And yet, what is remarkable is even among governments that are the most zealous in terms of pursuing those goals, no one has even come close to meeting those. That's true on the environment. It's also true when it comes to Indigenous. We all talk about a good game about the concern about the conditions that exist, third world conditions that exist on Indigenous in Indigenous communities in Canada, and we've had lots of talk over elections after elections, and yet there is no real substantial change that is happening over the course of decades on these particular issues. We're not seeing meaningful solutions that realistically address these problems being put onto the table. I call this a bit of performative polarization. There is a sense in which we have a set of orthodox talking points, and woe to the person who doesn't follow them. And if you don't follow them, you're the enemy. But in the meantime, we're seeing very little real progress towards some very substantive issues that we need to face together. It speaks to the fact that we have very significant divides in this country. And I think those divides are going to be expressed in all sorts of matters. And what is interesting is that it ties to the fact of what it means to be human along the way. We've seen advances in medicine. Used to be that medicine and technology was very much about overcoming sickness and disease. Now, medicine is very much about identity, about the perfect human, about whether or not we can get rid of Down syndrome, whether or not we can have laboratory babies in terms of sorting through this. It's interesting. It's not only about science, it's also about autonomy. I find it very interesting. We've been very active in the medical assistance and dying debate around Bill C-7. What I find remarkable is that there is a group of people for whom the right to choose whether or not to live or die carries much more weight than actual living, than life itself. The choice is a greater good than life. And so there is fundamental questions about what it means to be human. And in the midst of all of this, some sharp divides in the midst of our society are becoming evident. I've highlighted before that I actually think part of our challenge in dealing with the pandemic is the fact that we're not dealing with one, we're dealing with three pandemics that people in Canada have experienced very differently. We have divided our pandemic response based on political boundaries, and depending on which health unit you live in, depending on depending on which province you lived in, you're subject to different sorts of rules. In my own experience, and we have a home both in Hamilton and Ottawa, and I find it very interesting, even just the differences between the two communities in which we're a part in our own lives. I think there are three pandemics. Those who live in a more rural area, many of them are experiencing the pandemic simply through government regulation and through reading about it. But many of them do not know a single person who's had COVID. Many of them are simply seeing this as a bit of their day-to-day lives of the community that are there. It all seems a bit overdone to them. Then there is a second group. I'll call them a more suburban group. I don't think it strictly correlates to geography, but it largely does. There are people like myself whose income, we continue to be able to work at home. We continue to read the news, watch. Our neighbors are concerned about the pandemic. Many of us know people who've had COVID. We have seen the concerns about it. So there's a reality to it. And yet our day-to-day lives are fairly insulated and protected. And then there is a third pandemic, which is affecting primarily lower income frontline workers who are the ones in our grocery store, who's the Amazon delivery person who drops off the things at our door. People who the statistics are telling us are at a much greater rate of having the pandemic, and whose income security is way less than many of those of us in suburban. So there are three pandemics happening. And what's interesting, if we take a look at a macro level, there are lots of individual exceptions, but at a macro level, you may have seen the statistics the other day. For a good proportion of Canadians, their family income on a net basis with the reduction of costs and the government supports increases of up to 11%. There was a statistic the other day. We're seeing a lot of people for whom the pandemic has been a benefit economically and in various other ways. I also think that we're going to see the divide happen not just in terms of the pandemic and our social economic status and that. We're also going to be seeing significant divides between the public sector, which by and large has been able to continue working and certainly has been able to continue having their paycheck. They have retirement benefits that are there in a very different, collected and accrued in a very different way than many of us in the private sector. I think we see a growing public sector private divide. I also think we are seeing a younger and immigrant group that's entering the workforce that certainly does not have some of the benefits that those who are older are there. And I think it's going to be very interesting to watch how the vaccine, for example, over the course of the next year is going to be distributed, what order of priorities there are. There are significant divides. There are senses of unfairness and injustice between people in these different groups. And it's going to be interesting to watch how exactly those things unfold. So those 8 themes that I just highlighted for you, these are meant not necessarily to say these are the 8. I could have done 15 themes, or I could have done 3 themes as you want. But when I read any article in a newspaper, I'm thinking of these things happening underneath the surface. And I'm asking myself, as I read articles and I read books, in terms of trying to understand, what is this saying about these big transitional changes that already, these are transformational changes. These are the things that are going to make the world that I experienced in my 30s different than the world I experienced in my 50s. Peter Drucker, in 1993, shortly after the fall of the Berlin Wall, wrote a book and said, there are certain generations who live who experiences changes so dramatic that children do not recognize the world in which their parents are born. Drucker highlights the Protestant Reformation. He highlights the French Revolution, so 1517, 1789, the Industrial Revolution, and he was suggesting that perhaps the fall of the Berlin Wall, but certainly the generation alive today was going through a revolution in which the world was changing from the post-World War II bipolar world in which there were two predominant groups of powers that were a counterbalance to each other to a much more multilateral world. The advent of digital technology, which changes our experience. Certainly 2020 is going to be something that's going to be factored in. And so we are living in a world in which our children and our grandchildren aren't going to recognize the world into which we grew up. And I think it's helpful just to be cognizant of these bigger trends, these bigger issues of which I've just mentioned very briefly, 8 of them. Well, as we turn the calendar to 2021 and we read the news day to day, what are some of the specific things, specific ways this is likely to manifest itself? Well, I want to caution here, I'm not a prophet. I don't have a crystal ball. And what I'm about to say, together with $4, will buy you a coffee at Starbucks. But insofar as this is an informed and considered reflection, hopefully you'll find some of this helpful. So 10 things that I'm going to be paying special attention to as I'm reading the news in 2021. First of all, I think regional disparity and federalism. I was privileged to live for 12 years in Alberta. For the rest of my life, I've lived in Ontario, but I've traveled the country rather significantly. I remember in the 90s, when elections happened in the 80s and 90s, we ended up with 5 different political parties in Parliament. When you took a look at a political map, it was colored very different by different regions in the country. We're returning a little bit to that. We have the Bloc Québécois dominating Quebec. We certainly have the Conservatives dominating Western Canada, at least the prairie provinces. And then when you take a look at the other areas, you certainly see a significant political difference between the large urban centers and suburban and rural Canada. And so we are seeing a regional disparity, and there are distinct different attitudes towards the Federation. What is interesting is that COVID is making this a little more real and a little more challenging in the sense that the federal government, for reasons that I hinted at earlier in terms of the redefining of debt, federal governments are able to take on debt at far more attractive rates than our provinces. And so the vast majority of the debt that has been taken on by the government in the course of this COVID response has been taken on by the federal government. If you're following the news right now, you'll recall that last week in the economic statement, the feds announced the fact that they were going to spend well over $1 billion in long-term care. And the prime minister and the premiers are meeting tomorrow. What's interesting, and I think this is just symbolic, and when I was in Alberta in September, I said, let's pay special attention to this. My prediction is the federal government is going to try to pass on more and more of their transfers to provinces with strings attached. And you're seeing that with the money in terms of the health care. What's ironic is healthcare is a provincial responsibility. And I think we're going to see a dozen of these little skirmishes happening on the news day to day. The first one of them being tomorrow in terms of the first minister's meeting, in terms of what sort of strings are going to be attached to the $1.4 billion. To what extent is the federal government moving towards more of a unitary state in Canada that seeks to erase the differences and dominates with a central perspective and a central dominant point of view? And to what extent are we going to continue to be a federation? The sort of distinct group that was thought of when Section 91 and 92 of the Constitution were passed. I think for those, the province of Alberta has already announced that this fall there will be a referendum on whether or not equalization payment should continue to be. It's not binding, it has no weight, but the government of Alberta has already hinted. And there was lots of back and forth in terms of the fairness of that. So I certainly will be paying special attention as I watch the news to what I expect to be a lot of skirmishes of this sort in terms of the feds transferring money and announcing programs that are in provincial jurisdiction with strings attached. And the question is to the extent to which provinces are willing to be bought off and the extent to which they're going to assert themselves in terms of their own constitutional distinctions. I think that will have a very significant play. Not only are things changing in Canada in terms of the view of different regions vis-a-vis the country as a whole, the world itself is a very different place. And I don't have the time here to go in great lengths. Let me just use China as one example. I think whatever your thoughts are of the last number of years, what we have seen is the United States in particular has lost its undisputed leadership position in the world. There was again, there's data out in the last couple of years which show the regard that the United States has. They themselves have pulled out from a leadership position, whether or not you think it's a good thing or a bad thing along the way. The presidency of President Trump was the first presidency in, I think, 25 or 30 years in which the U.S. did not enter a war during the course of that presidency. There was very much a withdrawal and a focus on America first, and that has implications. Concurrent with that is the growth of China, and I will confess I'm not 100%. I'm not very favorable myself towards a lot of what China does and stands for. I'm quite concerned about a good amount of that. I think I'm not certain what their real game plan is, though. Are they truly a power that has aspirations to be a world dominant power? Or are they simply dealing with the reality of feeding 1.4 billion people? Even if you have an autocracy and are freed of some of the constraints of democracy as the government of China is, it is no small task for them to maintain social peace and to feed 1.4 billion mouths every day and keep that. So is China simply seeking to advance its economic interests, or does it have a broader interests along the way? Whatever the case, and we're certainly seeing that right now in the context of Hong Kong, and they're pushing back and blaming other countries. There is certainly a bit of a separation in terms of China and its relationship with the rest of the world. That's happening. I have one thing that I'm a little alone in terms of thinking this, but there's something that nags at me when I read China. And that is, I read both the political and the economic news. I also read the religious news. Back in the 90s, I came across Philip Jenkins' The End of Christendom, in which Philip Jenkins documents very quickly or very comprehensively, and he's done it in several editions since. The link is in the handout, in which he highlights the fact that global Christianity has moved from a northern and western hemisphere to a southern and eastern hemisphere religion. I cannot help but think of the fact that there are more people in China who attend worship each Sunday than in all of Europe combined. And there are implications. There has been throughout history, and there will continue to be implications when people adopt faith in general, of all faiths that are proselytizing, but the Christian faith in particular. We can take a look at the history in terms of how that has social implications. And I cannot help but wonder what the meaning of this is 5, 10, and 15 years hence. So I'm watching China, to be sure, with two lenses that in many ways are going opposite direction, and wondering how some of that is going to be resolved. I did say that there were going to be inelegant segues, and moving from China to education in North America, there is no quick, neat way of doing that. Let me just say that education, when we think of the development of countries in the world, typically when relief and support is brought to developing nations, the first thing you pay attention to is their medical and health needs. The second is education needs. It's a recognized that a strong education system is essential for a flourishing society. What is interesting is that education has taken on a new import. All of a sudden, here in North America, we used to, PISA scores were something you just read about, but most of us were just sending our kids off to school. What is remarkable is now all parents suddenly have become much more engaged in their own kids' education. And I'm very interested to see that whether or not people who are now not all parents are impressed by what they have been finding out about their kids' education. And I will be very interested to see whether or not this changes the educational choices, particularly as it relates to the independent school sector. There's two sides to that, though. On the one hand, the independent school sector, even if many parents wanted to choose independent schools today, there simply isn't the capacity to accommodate them. So what does that look like? What does choice in education look like in a post-pandemic world? I see time is going, so I'm going to just pick up the pace for these last few here. Redefine trade. The pandemic showed us the riskiness of supply chains. Look at if you're building a house, waiting for supplies, waiting for furniture. There's supply chains, all of it that cross borders for just-in-time delivery have been challenged by the pandemic. Add to that, over the last number of years, we have seen growing nationalization. Certainly, we saw that in the United States and in other countries. And so I'm wondering whether the era of free trade, which sort of defined the 80s, 90s, and 2000s, whether or not trade liberalization and the preference globally for free trade is going to be what it once was, or whether or not we're going to see changes. And that certainly has implications for companies, for regions, and for countries like Canada. Technology is a very significant area to pay attention to. Three very quick thoughts on technology. On the one hand, technology is rapidly expanding. All of us carry this iPhone along the way, and it has transformed our lives in terms of how we live day to day compared to what it's doing. And the technology that's available, in wee little cells today. I'm old enough yet that I still filled out computer cards and was introduced to computers in high school that occupied entire rooms that are bigger than my living room. The pace of technology continues to advance. I think the very fact that there is now a vaccine that's available and that is being, as of yesterday, people in Britain are getting a coronavirus. That was thought unthinkable just a few months ago, and yet the pace of change of technology is just rapidly advancing. I wonder about two things tied to that. There's the oh wow science of all of this in terms of what is possible. Tied to this, I wonder whether or not there will be the reflection on how these technologies are changing our lives in the same way as we all recognize the fact that the smartphone has changed our lives significantly. And then there are a host of ethical and moral questions that come with it. Everything from privacy and surveillance. Yesterday it was announced in Ontario, we're going to have a vaccine card. What's all going to be contained in that chip that I'm going to have to swipe in order to travel to certain places? Who's going to know what, and what choices do I functionally have? People. Again, an inelegant transition here. After World War II, which was the last significant spending of the sort that we have seen here, we grew our way out of that with a baby boom. Right now, we're not having a baby boom. In fact, children per female in Canada is at a record low right now. And we're reliant on 425,000 immigrants per year. That immigrant population not only is essential to us economically, but it also is coming from a pluralist background in terms of belief systems and all the rest. I would point out the challenge, often though, especially those in the more socially conservative circles when it comes to issues of faith and family are sometimes been hesitant about immigration. I would pose the question, especially to those communities, as to whether or not they may want to rethink their attitudes towards immigration. Whether or not the immigrants who are coming to Canada hold the values of faith and family in even greater, in more rooted ways than perhaps many who were born and raised in Canada and are the products of North America's education system. Family, tied to immigration, tied to having kids in the next generation is who gets to teach those kids. I think who owns the child, and we're seeing battles for that in terms of curriculum, in terms of who can foster parent. I reference in your handout, you have a link to some excellent research that my colleagues at Cardus Family have been doing regarding the role of parental choice in education. I would highlight that a lot of talk, even in terms of the daycare part of of the pandemic response is the fact that we have been talking about women's participation in the workplace, in the workforce, in almost purely in terms of its contribution to GDP. And we have forgotten the fact that all of these women, by definition, who are making these choices are mothers, and that when parents make choices about how their kids are raised, they're not simply thinking in terms of their ability to contribute to GDP. They're thinking in terms of their own kids and their own education. Free speech. 2 years ago at this time, the Canada Summer Jobs Program just came out with the checkbox saying that if you wanted to participate in a government program, you had to agree with the government on certain things. We've had a lot of issues on university campuses and in the media regarding free speech. I would highlight the fact that this is an issue of public policy. It is also a significant issue for communities of faith, in which those of us who have concerns that our voices aren't being heard in the mainstream need to be aware of self-censorship and self-marginalization. I would argue there's a lot more opportunities for free speech that we're not utilizing simply because sometimes we're too shy and we're too quiet. Leveraging local influence. At Cardus, we've just released a couple of months ago a very significant report about the contribution of religion to the public good. Faith and faith communities is the ninth largest sector of the economy in Canada, 67.5 billion, and yet it has a very poor brand. Most people think of faith as something that's very personal and very private, and the public implications of faith are not told. And I'll be looking for stories of how communities of faith learn to tell their own stories. So I apologize. That was that was 30 minutes in American currency. There was an exchange factor there. I took a few minutes longer than I intended to, but I look forward to your questions. Thank you.
Ray, you were just completely passionate about kind of presenting, so I give you a little bit of extra time. We'll talk about that later on when you're going to have to buy me a drink or something just to pay the price for that thing. But we're going to jump into questions as quick as possible. We've got lots of questions, and Ray, I'm going to challenge you to do a gut response to these questions, 60 to 90 seconds, and we'll get as many as possible. Okay, the first question is, isn't saying the family is foundational to society part of the bourgeois evangelical idolatrous ideology of family? So, let's get right to the point here. Are we overemphasizing the role of the family as compared to other institutions? Interesting question, long time debate, but more important now than ever, probably. Go for it, Pennings.
So a couple of things. First of all, what do we mean by family? I would agree that family, in the Western nuclear sense of the family of mom and dad and kids, with a particular ideal, as if that's the only way that family looks, is not accurate in terms of our society. I would highlight that for many fellow Canadians, family has a very multi-generational, uncles, aunts, cousins. There's a much different understanding of family than the way we narrowly think of family. Point number two, it still remains the family is a natural institution. We are all born into a family. We have no choice about the matter. We didn't pick our family along the way, and yet blood is thicker than water. There's thousands of years of human history to show that there is a particular bond that is there in family, even though we fully recognize that doesn't always take form in the idealized way, and that there's much hurt and challenge in families as there is help and support. Thirdly, and I think that was the point I was driving at, I wanted to highlight how almost all of the stories I've read in the newspaper have been how the government has been the savior, the government has been had our back. And if it wasn't for government, how would we have dealt with this pandemic? And I'm saying that's doing a disservice to the very significant contribution and arguably greater contribution that families have had to make in a home context, in a home setting.
Okay, point taken on that. I think there's worth more discussion on that. So next question is actually a really, really interesting question from the Amadea community. I'm fascinated by this. Lots of talk in the news as well with regard to this question about kind of referring to the 30s in Europe and the potential of conflict in this kind of situation. Are you in that space? Are you thinking that the kind of economic dislocation that we're seeing, the tension that's created out of this, just overall global instability, is suggesting anything of what we've seen before in terms of kind of war and conflict, or is that just pushing it just too far? What's your thoughts on that?
A couple of thoughts. I'm gonna duck the question to say I don't have a clear opinion one way or the other. I can see troubling things on both sides. So let me just quickly give you both sides. On the one hand, globally, take a look at what's happening with some of the groups in China and the persecution that's happening. Christians around the world, persecution, various religious groups, Muslims around the world in certain segments are facing persecution as well. We are facing persecution in our generation of that simply isn't making the news, but that is very significant in terms of its size along the way. When it comes closer, secondly, the very nature of war, the nature of the nation state has changed. Take a look at the wars, whether that's been Afghanistan, whether that's been since 2001. In terms of ISIS and all the rest, it's not state against state. There's very different sorts of wars and conflicts that are being there. Even some of the battles that are happening right now that are happening with drones and the very technology of war looks very different. On the flip side, so there are some things that one could look at and say, yes, there's good reason to be concerned. And I think it would be foolishness to simply say peace and stability in our times and we're not going to see a major global conflict. I think that would be naive. Okay. That said, I wouldn't predict it. On the other hand, I think there are lots of things that still hold people together. Even let's just move to North America. I don't really pretend to be a global expert along the way. But if I take a look at North America, I continue to reach out and to hold the fact that we have an awful lot in common, and that even though there is a polarization and tribalism in our politics, let me just highlight I don't know if there's a sense among some that we're in a culture war. There's an absolute there's a victim mindset that some people have, in which every institution is out to get, that the progressives are out totally to get and silence traditionalists or whatever the other side of the spectrum is, and vice versa, and that it's almost a reparation, if you will, for the years in which there was oppression from traditionalists on those who now identify as progressives. I'm not certain I don't buy entirely into that. I see some very alarming signs. I see lots of signs of hope and lots of examples, particularly at community levels, in which I think there is hope. And fundamentally, I'm a Christian, and I think a Christian should operate out of a premise of hope in terms of what the power of the gospel is and can be in a society. And I don't think we live our lives out of fear. I think we live out of the plausibility of the hope that the gospel gives us.
Interesting. Let's jump to Reverend Sterling's question, because I think it's an interesting question, pretty kind of salient right now. You've watched, Ray, much of the dialogue and the difficulty between figuring out the relationship between the church and the state in a COVID environment. Can you comment on this question that Andrew is posing with respect to the church and the state at this time?
Can you just read me the question? Unfortunately, I'm not.
It's a long question. Relates to the change in church-state relationships and the intrusion of the state into the life of the church. This is seen, of course, in religious closures, which are understood in light of the pandemic, of course, but could have been handled in a less draconian fashion, and also the way that churches are impeded in their charity work because of constraints on the CRA. Ray, I know you've been in this discussion substantially. I would love to hear your point of view on this.
Yeah, I think
where's the balance here?
Yeah, there's a couple of things. First of all, I think we are facing the problem, and there was a piece we published in Convivium last Friday. Maybe somebody wants to put that in the chat, in terms of faith communities in part have themselves to blame in the sense that their story is not understood in society as well. We have not been successful in having society as a whole understanding the fact that faith is in fact an essential service. And where it belongs and where it fits in. Part of that is we've lived our lives too long in our privatized communities, and our faith has not been as public or plausible as it should be. So Let's start there. That said, I would be very critical of some government steps that basically puts, when you can have the inconsistencies we see between some restaurants and stores and faith institutions not being able to open under parallel circumstances. If I understand the situation in British Columbia, it strikes me very differently than it does here in Ontario, for example. So I think there's lots of nuance. I have seen some pieces of legislation and restrictions that I think are very problematic. And if I were a church leader in those jurisdictions, I certainly would be at a minimum talking to my lawyer and seeing about getting injunctions, because I think they violate the free exercise, our constitutional freedoms. In other jurisdictions, I see people saying, wait a minute, this is totally unfair. But I actually see the state acting in a fairly neutral way and treating faith institutions from a public health point of view in a pretty even-handed manner with others. So there's lots of nuance to answering that question. I did highlight, I'll just mention, I do a weekly newsletter. I think that's been highlighted in the past. Last Saturday, I dealt very much with civil disobedience and the bar, and just highlighting that when we take on civil disobedience, we take on much more than the issue at hand. We actually take in the very nature of authority and the rule of law, and it does speak to our plausibility as well. So,
okay. Ray, thanks for that. I want just a little bit of a shift here. Great question from Mark DeMerton on interest rates, basically saying, you know what, Ray, you're a little bit overcautious here. These low interest rates, number one, are structural. They're going to stick around for a while. What's your worry? Our debt to GDP isn't as troublesome, although this, you know what, that may change in the next 2 years ahead. By the way, even think World War II, if I would just to even accentuate Mark's argument, World War II, the debt we incurred over World War II, we never paid for. The only way we paid for it was just building a larger economy with lots of children. The interesting pushback, I think there's a valid argument there. Are you just too worried about debt?
I'm actually not. I share Mark's general belief that with low interest rates, if you actually take a look at the cost of debt servicing, compared to other places, we're nowhere near where we were in the 90s yet. And there's a lot of runway. There's a lot of space. That said, global interest rates aren't entirely in control. So there's an element of rolling the dice in all of that. But I accept Mark. I think most economists would say that there's good reason to think that in the immediate future, the combination of low interest rates plus economic growth will allow us to manage this debt. I think what I worry a little bit, though, is the mind. It's one thing to incur debt with a sense of maintaining some guardrails and maintaining a direction forward. It's quite another if fundamentally you believe that you don't ever have to repay the debt, and that's repaying it isn't a factor in your calculations. Yep. I think you're rolling a dice on an untested economic theory, and they've done that a few times in histories before, and the result hasn't always been wonderful.
Interesting. I'm not sure I'm completely on track with that. I think I'm more concerned about that. Mark, if I was sitting, having a glass of wine with you or something like that, I think there's a whole other moral dynamic to this, and it's the question of whether we can agree on behalf of the future to what obligations that they have to carry. There's no two ways about it. World War II was a really good illustration that we were able to build ourselves out of the debt, but that's because we were in a demographically actually reproductive time of life. The only way we could do that was with immigration now. But the moral question, and I've been having a debate with a friend of mine on the board of Cardus on this, is there a moral dynamic or dilemma that we run into when we are obligating a next generation? There's no way we're going to pay this debt off in our generation time. And next generation, when we haven't actually sought a consensus or we built a social consensus with a generation unborn. Mark, I look forward to that conversation with you. There's another interesting question, Ray, that's come up from Jack Vanderkooy. It gets to the kind of the charitable question. Ray, do you see alternative sources of financing for social change in communities? as a response to the pandemic economic recovery? I'm thinking of community bonds, special purpose enterprises, that kind of thing. Are we going to get creative? Here's really the question about: are we going to get more creative than traditional charitable support within our local communities? That's more robust than kind of the binary government jumping in or local communities writing checks to pay the bills.
This invites much more than the 30-second response here, Jack. I'm actually a bit pessimistic about the entire charitable sector and the nature of charitable returns.
Interesting.
Very quickly, 30 years ago, if I said charities and the top charities in Canada, you would have thought of United Way and Salvation Army and Red Cross and cancer societies and charities. You could identify the work they were doing. Today, I think the top 25 charities, like 20 of them are like university and hospital foundations doing things that 20, 30 years ago that your taxes paid for. So we are seeing a huge shift in charitable dollars being directed to what historically was the government sphere, which actually means the decline in charitable giving in Canada is just way bigger than the statistics even make it out to be. I don't know. I worry as to when we're going to come to the tipping point in which the charitable donations and that charitable sector, which, of $10, $12 billion, whatever it is right now, that charitable sector itself is going to shrink in the context of the overall and simply be drowned out by government space. And I worry a little bit about, the social impact bonds and some of the experiments that took place in Great Britain and some of the other ways of financing social change. They've had mixed results at best.
Okay, appreciate that. James Waller has a question. Ray, I'm curious about your perspective on what our societal forms to be in 5 years from now as it relates to mental faith and economic impacts of 2020. More succinctly stated, what do you anticipate you can expect as it relates to mental health, family health, and the strength of faith if you kind of had a forecast down the road? Quick reaction to that. It's a great question.
I think, in many ways, one of the things, if I put on my Christian elder's hat, if you will, when you share the gospel along the way, the first thing somebody needs is to know their need. And one of the things that the current pandemic is doing is creating an awareness of need. And we're seeing that need being answered in perverse ways with opioids, with record suicide rates, with all sorts of, but those are expressions of need. Those are expressions of concern. And we are seeing that expression of concern in wider and different ways than we have in the recent past. So there's an opportunity. I think the question is going to be how communities of faith, are they going to plausibly and credibly respond to that? And I think there's, on that sense, there's a huge opportunity.
It's interesting. I think James's question is going to be a question that we wished we would have spent a lot more time on 5 years actually down the road. I think he's onto something. And just even on the mental illness stuff, the things we do not know on this front and that COVID has actually brought out even more powerfully that's pretty strong. We've already kind of gone 6 minutes past our time, and I want to respect our time. I appreciate the audience going a little bit further on this than what we had planned. I'm just going to do two more questions here. One from John Clayton. Curious about Ray's thoughts on the impact of postmodernism, critical race theory. We've all heard that discussion. It's become it actually is an academic idea, not just a political football. Critical race theory, diversity, inclusion, equity, impacts on society and Christian community. Ray, do you want to jump in on that? Forget the political side to this.
In 30 seconds. What I think is interesting, I'm a bit of a fan of Charles Taylor. For those in terms of postmodernism, along the way, he talks about changing definitions of secularism. Very quickly, he says secularism has gone through three stages. It used to be sort of a neutral description of geography. The priest had a sacred vocation. The butcher, the baker, the candlestick maker was secular. Then it moved to secularism being neutrality. It was the referee in the public square that made sure everybody paid fair. Now secularism it's put on a team jersey. It has its own proselytizing way of thinking. And I think we're certainly seeing that. And, it has lots of nuance. It's not a single thing. Postmodernists don't all agree with themselves. There's lots of internal debate, particularly as even some of the traditional LGBTQ looking in terms of sexual orientation, and now we're seeing entire gender fluidity along the way. It's just interesting reading internal debates, even within those communities along the way. This is a very complex question. I think the key is, and this is where I go back to Taylor says we are the first society that is attempting to build without any reference to the transcendent, as if we are all that there is. And I think that is a venture that is destined to fail, and I say that for theological reasons.
Okay, you know what? It's 5:08. I'm just Ray. I just want to thank you for just the effort you make day by day to be a keen observer on in our times, and I'm also thankful that you're actually eager to hear what other points of view are out there. Ladies and gentlemen, I just want you to know we got so many questions and responses and comments, and we're going to take them all seriously. Ray especially is going to live with them. It does truly help form our thinking. So just a quick comment before we go. Let me leave you with this. There is no doubt that in the last 10 months, we've seen a dramatic acceleration of architectural changes in society and the institutions that give them form and structure. And I just want to remind you of Cardus's basic thesis. Here it is. We're essentially arguing that the Christian faith actually does have a lot to offer the problems we face today. And really our job at Cardus is to advance that idea into the public square, into the political arena, and to research those kind of questions and actually make a credible and thoughtful case for that. How are we going to do that? We're going to do it with poise. We're going to do it with grace. We will be faithful. We'll be intense, and we're going to be a touch aggressive as well. On the other hand, we're going to have fun. We're going to have lots of fun. We're going to show respect to those who may disagree with us as well. And we'd love you to join this project in many different ways we can. We're so privileged to be able to do this at Cardus. So some of you can help us, and in many different ways. Some can, and many of you have already through your financial gifts. We encourage you to do that as well. Some by leveraging your own networks. We need a Cardus message, not to just go through our own communication channels, but through yours as well and through your networks. That's what accentuates the power in the conversation. And also some of you by your prayers for us here at Cardus and for our country, Canada. Thank you so much, ladies and gentlemen, for being patient with us. Thank you for jumping into dialogue and thoughtfulness. And may these kind of questions kind of land at your dinner table and land in your own reading as well. And may God bless you and God bless our country. Thank you very much.